Hi, today my colleagues and I will be talking about why residential schools should be supported. To start, I want to introduce a couple of key figures. First of all, Pedro Ponce de Leon introduced sign language to deaf people in an attempt to spread his religious beliefs. But the real father of the deaf education was Charles Michel de Lieppe, who founded the School for Deaf Children of Paris in 1760. Another key figure was Father Roche Ambrose Sicard, who was the second principal of the National Institute in 1789. He trained a brilliant deaf man named Laurent Clerc. Laurent Clerc was convinced to move to North America by Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet in 1817 to start USA's first school for the deaf. He introduced sign language and French teaching methods to North America.
Another key figure who has more of a negative impact on the deaf community is Alexander Graham Bell. He is known as the inventor of the telephone. Not many are aware of his impacts on the deaf community. He was a proponent of eugenics. Eugenics is a form of oppression against race, disability, and other minority groups. It served as a study and system in order to bring what was considered desirable traits to the forefront of society and to weed out traits that were considered undesirable. Eugenics impacted and oppressed people all over the spectrum. During a large portion of the early 20th century, eugenics was quite popular in America. It gained its destructive notoriety because of the Holocaust and Adolf Hitler's obsession with creating what he considered a perfect superior race. Oralism is the method of teaching deaf children through reading speech cues and focuses on teaching through speaking or an oral approach rather than with sign language. Oralism was a way to incorporate the use of eugenics towards the deaf community. Oralism served as a way to force people of the deaf community to adjust and live only in a spoken world. Oralism created a negative connotation to mainstream schooling for the deaf community. It made it difficult for the deaf people to receive the education they deserve. Oralism's fall occurred when enough students' schooling indicated that this was not a successful learning method.
Okay, so now that we know some history and we also know the rise and fall of oralism, we have to introduce what mainstreaming is. We also have to see why this is a valid option or why it's seen as a valid option. And we also have to understand why the deaf community is opposed to this method. Mainstreaming is actually a term used to describe the integration of children with hearing loss into regular school classrooms in order for them to learn among hearing peers. And the reason why it seemed to be the preferred choice is because mainstreaming allows children to be closer to their hearing peers, and parents, in an attempt to integrate them with hearing peers early on, usually pick this option. Unfortunately, deaf members of society think that the mainstreaming option is very catastrophic to their well-being, and they're most likely to be proponents of the residential schools. So let's understand what the difference is. First, because deaf children are able to live among their hard of hearing and deaf peers with the residential school education, they are building a strong community and building familiar-like ties. At a mainstream school, they're likely to be the only deaf or hard of hearing student, and an overwhelming amount of deaf people actually find themselves feeling very isolated in the mainstream setting. Second, in residential schools, teachers are most likely deaf and deaf aware, so they're most likely able to cater to each individual student's needs, versus in a mainstream setting. Deaf and hard of hearing students are not catered to, and sometimes are actually lost in the education system because they're receiving no support from their teacher. Third, sign language is the main form of communication, which allows for easy communication in a language that is best known by deaf students. In the mainstream setting, there is little to no use of sign language, so communication is not made easy for these deaf students. And the last and probably the most important point is that deaf culture and deaf history are taught and encouraged in the residential school setting. So role models that are deaf are actually introduced to students, and they're more likely to see themselves in a more positive light. Versus in the mainstream education setting, deaf culture and deaf history is relatively unknown and not likely to be taught at all. So deaf role models are not known to these deaf students. And all these points are actually the reasons why we believe residential schools are the best option for deaf students. And I just want to point out that the clear choice is that these deaf students should be taught in residential schools.